Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Miller Library here on the Western New Mexico University campus. Today, we're really excited because we have an event that's ending our celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, which is from September 15th to October 15th. And we do have one extra bonus event, which is this weekend, the Chicano Street Fest, which is here at Old Gym Stadium on Friday and Saturday. So I encourage everyone to come out to that. This is a really exciting exhibit. It's a traveling exhibit. It's been making its way through Deming and other places, and now it's here in Silver City, and it will be up here in the Miller Library through November 15th, so for 1 month. So today you're going to hear from a couple of special guest speakers who are visiting our campus, who are going to tell us about the important history that we should all know about related to the Bracero labor movement. So to introduce our first speaker, we have Diego Luna from the Department of Student Life.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to present Raymond Gold. Raymond Gold is a native New Mexican. Growing up in Hachita, New Mexico, he first introduced to the Bracero program at age of 11 when he was hired to translate for a man in the program. Raymond is endlessly interested in people and their stories. After a lifelong career in law enforcement, Gold now focuses on documenting local history.
Good evening. Thank you. A couple of things. I'm also a graduate of Western New Mexico University, class of '69, long before any of you were even born. Anyway, before I forget, I am in awe of this very, very beautiful library, and I can remember back to the time when I first came here. And I graduated from high school in Hachita, New Mexico. It's barely in Grant County, and we just recently had a reunion there, and we tripled the population, so there was about 80 people there at the reunion, and that was for anybody that ever drove through Hachita and heard the name or could find Hachita on the map. Those are the requirements for being able to go to that reunion. And on top of that, we danced probably for about 4 hours straight, hardly missing a single dance. But the main thing about that is that we recollect, a lot of us old folk, we sat around and recollected all the various events in our lives while we were growing up in Hachita. During that period of time, like I say, I had an occasion to know firsthand what it was like to work with Braceros. This is not a documentary, it's a collection of stories that I managed to put together and have them interpreted by various people, including Lalo here. It's just amazing because at various times I find out that a lot of people don't have any idea about the Bracero program. So there are some facts. It started in 1942, and for those of us that are students of history, 1942 was very important because that was very shortly after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, and we declared war on Japan, and then sooner after Germany declared war on us, and vice versa. The main thing about that is that certain people sat down and decided, what are we going to do? Because what's going to happen is that that kid at the filling station is not going to be there. That kid that was mixing sodas at the drugstore is not going to be there. He's going to be recruited into the Army, the Air Force, Army Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard. So the nation understood, the leaders of the nation understood, all these young men would be going off to war pretty soon. So a lot of the farmers, a lot of the people in agriculture, a lot of people in the food industry said, what are we going to do? Who's going to harvest the fields? Who's going to harvest the watermelons, the grapes, potatoes, the strawberries, all the food that we provide for the nation? Who's going to do that work? And of course, they turned to a neighbor to the south, the Republic of Mexico. And in 1942, they drew up an agreement between the Republic of Mexico and the United States. And as a result of that process and agreements, they decided they were going to allow people and workers from Mexico to come to the United States to help with the harvest. These people would be vetted, they'd be investigated, and they would be put in fields throughout the United States. I think there was at the very least, about 34 states that had braceros. The first year was about somewhere between 12,000, 14,000, because it started out kind of slow. And then the years after that, they had a couple 100,000 every year. And the braceros would come in, they would be recruited and assembled in various areas in Mexico, usually in cities close to the border. And then they would be checked out by the local authorities there, the state authorities, the federal authorities of Mexico, and then they would be vetted and allowed to proceed across to the United States, where they underwent physical examination and testing and various things, including, if you notice in the picture, they were stripped and sprayed like cattle, and they would be assembled. They walked around inside the assembly areas with only their particular documents put in front of them as fit leaves for their privacy. They had a sense of humor, because a lot of them would say, here we are, all atoms, and where are the Eves? But that was one of the things that they did to break the tension. But can you imagine yourself being stripped naked and just lining up by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands, and then sprayed with DDT because you might be carrying some kind of awful disease that you didn't want to allow into the United States. This program had very good points, and it also had some very bad points. I'm not here to cast any negative power on either operation, but the fact is they needed these people. These people were willing to come in. And obviously, those of us that know anything about human anatomy know that in Spanish, brazo means an arm, or bracero is someone who works with his arms, with his hands. And those are the kind of people that they wanted, that would endure working out in the fields day after day after day. Rain, sunshine, freezing temperatures, hot 118-degree temperatures, especially in places like Imperial Valley in California, Southern California. And so a lot of the people that came across had to endure and learn how to get used to the various climates. And on top of that, they had to get used to the different types of food that was served to them. You go from a place like Michoacan, a state in northwestern Mexico, all the way to Idaho or Wyoming to pick potatoes, and the climate is not the same, the food is not the same, and so it was tough. So they ended up having to bring in or designate cooks that knew how to cook the type of food that the Mexicans would, and the braceros would be able to tolerate. And so what happened is that they ended up being served all kinds of food. And one of the things that impressed me when I was involved in it was how hard they worked and how dedicated they were to this program. I'd say when I was about 11 years old, a rancher came to me in Hachira and asked me, he said, if I wanted to work with him. And I asked him, doing what? He said, well, I've got 5 braceros. And what I have to do is I have to leave the ranch periodically, and I have to have them continue working. Okay, what do I do? He said, well, you translate, I'll leave you written orders, you translate to them what it is I want them to do. There were about 5, sometimes it was 4, but I would go and tell them the rancher wants you to clean out all the cattle troughs, water troughs at these various windmills. So we would do that. I was 11 years old, I was driving the truck, 3-speed Chevy, I think it was a 51, something like that, pickup. And which was a pretty good experience for me. And then we would go over to the windmills. They work on the windmills. They repair the windmill gearshift assembly. The next thing that happened is that we'd come back and we would eat, usually about 7:30 at night. Go straight to bed because we were so tired. I didn't do that work for them. They also built fences and stretched barbed wire for miles and miles and miles around the ranch. And they would sit down with me and they would ask me to write letters. And the letters I would write home for them. I got to see how they felt about certain things. I understood that they were writing to their sweethearts, or writing to their mothers, or writing to their parents, or uncles and aunts and so forth. Or they're writing to their brothers and sisters and telling them how great a life, or how not so great a life they were having at the time. And all this time, they were filling the jobs that needed to be filled throughout the nation. On top of that, they also worked on railroads. They would go to places like El Paso, be recruited there, put to work on the railroads. They would be put to work in the mines. So many, many people ended up having to learn new skills, learn how to operate machinery. In some of these pictures, if you notice, there's a rancher, a farmer checking out, grabbing people by the arm and whatever, and kind of wonder what he's doing. Is he welcoming them? No, what he's doing is he's feeling their hands and feeling the strength in their arms and to see if they have calloused hands, which tells him this is a person that's used to hard labor. And it's stupid. You have to be bending out in the fields all day long picking whatever it is, strawberries, potatoes, whatever it is that the farmer is happy to grow. The other thing too is that he wants to look in the eyes, he wants to see what the personality is like for that particular worker. Because, I think it's over there, because what he wants to know is this a humble, is this an acquiescent type of employee? Because that's what I want. If I'm a farmer, I want a worker that can work with his hands and understands that I want him to do what I tell him. I don't want him involved in anything else other than get up in the morning, go to work in the fields, come back, and do whatever is necessary in terms of eating, washing, sleeping, and then going back out in the fields the next day, over and over again until my crop is harvested. They would sign contracts, and the contracts went from anywhere from 6 months, 2 months, to 18 months, a year and a half. The impression I got from talking to various former braceros that were living here in this part of the country was they expressed gratitude, and they said how lucky they were to have come to New Mexico to get jobs. And that was because in New Mexico, places like Doñana County, Luna County, some places in Grant County, obviously don't have Cheetah. The straw bosses or the field bosses were pretty much like them. They were descendants of Mexico, people that came from Mexico. They were, and they spoke Spanish, and they provided the same type of food pretty much as they had experienced back in their hometowns. The huge majority of these people came from these very small villages that were used to going out in the fields every day to work. Those were the people that were most valued. In New Mexico, what I was told by several people is that they ended up coming out here and working, and then they were valued by their employers to the point where many of them ended up being helped to get their permanent residency and eventually get their citizenship, and then bring their families across. In one instance, there in the Hatch Valley, for instance, one of the supervisors for the juvenile probation and parole office told me a number of years ago that her father was a bracero, and he came over, and his employer valued him so much that he ended up teaching him how to use various farm equipment, besides tractors and balers and cotton pickers and all that kind of stuff. And those are because he was able to teach him. He didn't have to rely on the unknown quantity of workers that came in. To the point where he helped him bring his family across. He gave him a house and got him a citizenship, and said when we were kids, my mom would go off to the hospital in Las Cruces to have a baby, and then the wife of the farmer would bring us in and put us there in the living room floor, about 4 or 5 of us, and watch over us until my mom came home from the hospital. That's one end of the spectrum. Another end of the spectrum was the way that they were treated in some instances of just a constant system of betrayal, where they would be brought in, given housing, and then charged for their meals. And as soon as they became any kind of a problem with it medically, they got rid of them. If you got hurt on the job, they got rid of you, sent you back to Mexico as soon as possible. They used the police, they used the sheriff's department to harass these people, to prevent them from organizing, to prevent them from assembling or getting any type of ideas about using their numbers to try to correct the system and get better working conditions. Things were tough on them. Things so bad that in East Texas, the Mexican government said they would not permit braceros to cross through their ports of entry into Texas until they got better working conditions. But they worked in Texas, they worked in Louisiana, Florida, in the citrus crop harvest. They worked in Washington State, Oregon, in the apple harvest. Obviously, Idaho, Wyoming, in the potato harvest. In Michigan, they worked over there harvesting cranberries. And they also worked in railroads in New York and Detroit. And so people just don't realize at this day how much they contributed to keep the food system going during those war years. The program basically was so successful that the farmers and the growers wanted to hang on to this pool of cheap labor that it extended all the way until 1964, when they officially closed the program. Reactions to them, if you have if you keep in mind some of the things that's going on currently, we had similar reactions by various people to the program in the 1940s and 1950s that we have currently going on with immigration going on today. But they talked about complaining about religious people getting involved in the local labor industry. And there's even a New York congressman that presented pictures depicting braceros as card-carrying communists. And they purport to show that they were carrying knives and machetes and those kind of things that were confiscated by the Border Patrol and so forth. So anyway, there was praise and there was condemnation from one end to the other. The things that they used to write back and forth on the letters, including my mom, she used to write letters for them. But some of the letters were very poignant. They told about the conditions in the families. In my case, one of those braceros that I was working with had a little sister that died, and he was unable to get back. They told him she was sick, and what he did was that the next letter that I read to him was told that she had died and they had already buried her before he had a chance to go back. And mind you, in those, even today in Mexico, if you die, they have a funeral for you and they bury you very, very quickly. There's not much of an involvement institution like we have here in the United States. So a lot of people that have relatives in Mexico were unable to get back to their funeral services in time. There are a lot of accidents, particularly around the Salinas area. A truckload of braceros were hit by a train, and I get something 20 some odd braceros died. So it was disheartening to many of them. I had an uncle that decided he was born in Juarez. He came across during the Bracero program. He went to the Phoenix area with a friend of his, and his housing was an old car body, and that's what he slept in. And the grower would allow him to bring a couple of 5-gallon buckets to use as water to drink and bathe in. So there was a lot of abuses. So anything, one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we got across to you is we have a sculptor named Diane Lamar. She is responsible for these various sculptures in there, and she's taken them from the various paintings and from the photographs that were available. She has a marvelous, marvelous talent. All the way from, there's a truck over there which she acknowledged, one of the people acknowledged that the truck was very, very essential to the Bracero program. This is what they carried the workers back and forth into the various fields. And like in Imperial Valley, people learned how to go through at 3 o'clock in the morning with a flashlight and check the plants, the squash plants, for bugs that could ruin the entire field. They checked for fungus. And once he became adept at this, those growers wanted those same employees. So whenever the contracts went up, they wanted to make sure those same people came back, because now they showed their worth, now they showed their value. Other places, they didn't care. They worked on strawberry fields. I worked as a federal police officer in Fort Worth, California, and I was living in Salinas at the time, so I had to drive back and forth. I think it was about 18 miles. And you could smell the beautiful smell of the strawberry fields, and I would, believe it or not, I was on the SWAT team, so I had to get out there and run, drive my bicycle and so forth. But that was very pleasant, running through those fields, through those roads that join in the fields. And only later, when I started working with the sheriff's department, did I see where they would, if you go up some of those little canyons, some of those little cutouts, you would see families in there, and they're living in cardboard boxes, even then. And that was back in 1988, 1989, 90, all the way to 1994. And so periodically, the people would complain, and periodically the county would send the inspectors out there, and periodically the sheriff's department would go out there and move those people out. And so the farmer would simply move the workers to a different part of the field. As you can see, there's a weighmaster. In one of our situations, there's a man that came across and says, I was very good at picking cotton. So my job, or my ambition, was to become a weighmaster, because he gets paid a lot more than the ordinary people do. Because I learned how to use the scales, I learned how to firm up the bags of cotton and everything else, and you can see they're going to get paid for a quota of cotton. If it's less than X number of pounds, they're not going to get paid. They have to go back in the fields and fill that bag until that bag reaches a certain and I don't know exactly how much the weight is, but it's probably close to 100 pounds. The other thing too is there we have a picture of the short hoe. They call it cortito. And that was supposedly, the comments were by some grower that they used the short hoe because it kept them down close to the plants so that they wouldn't ruin the plants and harvest the produce. And at the same time, it kept them from leaning on their hoes and becoming lazy and so forth. The cortito supposedly was an invention of the Chinese immigrants that came across from China during various stages of our country's history and after building the railroads and so forth. And supposedly they were the ones that invented it, but it was commonly used in California and various other states. California eventually outlawed it. They had a state Supreme Court decision that said that was a dangerous tool with which to work. To this day, a lot of the braceros that have survived have had horrible, horrible back problems because of working out there in the fields and stooping over day after day after day after day. A lot of growers didn't necessarily respect Sundays or anything like that. They did provide a day of rest, sometimes a couple of days of rest, but only because they had to clean the fields and move them from one place to another and give them enough rest so they'd be able to work the next day. A lot of them became very adept at working in cotton gins and working with the sorting machines that would sort like potatoes and grade them from one size to another, and they became adept at knowing when to plant. And these people became very valuable to their grower because then that person was able to go and do some other things besides to sit there and watch the braceros work. Anyway, let me just read you a couple stories here, and I often wonder how hard it would be for us. You know, we live now in a mechanized society where a lot of these crops are picked with machines, but at this point, even today, a lot of those crops still have to be picked by hand. It's still going on in California and other places throughout the United States. And obviously, they tried many, many times for many, many years to get machines to pick cotton. And even when they did, they still employed a lot of people in the cotton industry until finally most of the farmers and the growers were allowed to, got the resources to buy cotton pickers. This is a story from Pedro. He's a potato picker. This is what he says. It's not easy picking potatoes, but I did it. I won lots of respect from my fellow workers because I could pick potatoes quickly and without getting too many small potatoes in my costal, my bag. My name is Pedro. I come from a little rancho in Sonora, near a place called San Pedro. I was a bracero. I was only 19 years old when I was asked by many of my friends to go with him to the north. I helped my father run his farm and helped my grandfather run his little rancho. I hired out as a laborer around my little pueblito. I had a sweetheart named Margarita. She was 16 and was after me to marry her. But I wanted to be able to have enough money to support her. Her father was a merchant. He sold cloth, sewing supplies, sombreros. He agreed to consider me as a delivery boy to the villages around San Pedro. He would make fun of me and tell me that I was named for the town, and the town was not named for me. I just knew I had to learn English to be able to get ahead. I did not like Margarita's father very much, and I could not see myself working for him for the rest of my life. It was mid-September 1943. I was told by an agent recruiting workers that I could earn lots of money in the United States because there's so much work and few workers there. Most of the men had been called to the Ejército, the army, and there was no one to harvest the beans, vegetables, potatoes, cotton, and fruits. I could earn money to send back home to my family. I could be back home in 4 to 6 months. I was young, I wasn't married, and I wanted to have a good house for my wife. When I did get married, I had 2 older brothers, Jose Maria and Victor. Victor was married, and his wife complained a lot about not having her own place. Even though my mother was a kind woman, she insisted all of us had to do our share of work around the house. One of the things that they did, and to some degree is still accustomed today, is when these workers would leave to go to the north after being recruited, when they left the home, the mothers or the parents would put like a sheet, sometimes a little rug on the floor, and they would have their sons kneel before them, and they would give them a blessing. And what they would do is, they knew or they felt because they had to give them a blessing, they would anoint their heads and put the sign of the cross on their foreheads. And the reason for this was because they thought, this might be the very, very last time I see my son or my nephew, depending on what the family connections were. And to this day, I've seen a couple of those instances. Now, mostly a lot of the families that I am aware of do that to their sons or their daughters that are going into the military. It's odd to see it, but it's something that I remember. I served a tour in Vietnam. I graduated here in 1969. My draft board called me and told me they were going to allow me to graduate, but in December I would be drafted. Sure enough, they did. I received my draft notice and I reported to Fort Worth, California, where I eventually worked again. And I was there 2 weeks and sent me home for 2 weeks. I thought, this is marvelous. I think the Army and I can get together. Of course, after that, I went back to the Army and I didn't get home for almost 2 years. So you kind of have to be careful what you ask for. So I understood, and most of these people understood, that this might be the very, very last time they see this individual. It's a religious thing, it's in Catholicism, and it's practiced probably less so now than before, but during that period of time when droves and droves and droves, thousands of people, up to probably 4 to 4.5 million of them came across the border. They left their homes, they left their families to come and work in the United States.
Thank you, Emilio. Next we have Lorenzo, who's a special guest coming all the way from Demington. He's recently retired after 22 years serving in the military in the Air Force, and after 21 and a half years of serving as an administrator in the public school system. And please welcome Lorenzo.
Thank you. I see a lot of familiar faces here. I was an administrator at Deming Public Schools. I was assistant principal at Deming High School for 10 years. And then I became a principal at Deming Intermediate School for the last 2. So I've seen a lot of students come and go. Thank you. Thank you for following your dream. Okay? So I want to thank you. Buenas tardes, by the way, buenas tardes. Thank you for allowing me a little bit of time to tell you my dad's story. I'm the son of a Bracero. Okay? I live the Bracero life. So I want to give you a little bit of history about my dad, and tell you a little bit of a few things that we did together, and My first experience with the Bracero program was about 6 years ago. And it was part of National History Day. And we had students that would compete to go to Washington, D.C. They would do projects and present the projects, and then one of the projects was the Bracero program. I had about 3 of the kids that their parents were Braceros, so they decided to do an expose, a project on the Braceros. So we took pictures, and they researched it, and they presented it. They went to Washington, D.C. with that program. Since that day is when I realized how important, like Mr. Cobo said, the Braceros were to us and to me. My dad, his name was Ramon Mendoza. He passed away in 2001. He was 75 years old. He came from a small town, very small town, called San Onofre, Municipio de Satebo, Municipio de Chihuahua. So we were a little bitty place out by the river. He helped my grandpa with farming, and I don't know if you know about the weather down in Mexico. They don't have acequias, they don't have drip systems. The water they get, they plant the seeds. The water they get is what grows. So he was a farmer to begin with. In 1950, he left his wife and 2 sons at the time to become a bracero. He wanted to provide the family a better life. I am the 3rd child, and I was born in 1953. We would see my dad 2 or 3 times a year. The rest of the time he was over here. He worked in Luna County, farming with particularly about 3 different farming families. The Bocalis, Wells, and Sajak families. He planted cotton, corn, and milo. He became a U.S. resident in 1962 and brought the family to Deming in 1963. By that time, there was 4 of us, 4 boys. And unlike some of the negative experiences that you heard from Mr. Cobos, my dad's experience and my experience was very positive. We were treated very well. We were provided a place to live. As far as health, that was provided also. Our families would get together with the other Bracero families in the area. So we had like a support system for each other. So we went to school, and the same kids hung around together, went from year to year, and we became friends for life. The weekends were fun. Going mostly into town, shopping, food shopping, and meeting the other families. Spruce and Pine Streets in Deming, if you know Deming, small town. It's just the center of town. It was a very busy place, very busy place. Another thing that you could see in Deming, since Mr. Cobos brought it up, he talked about all the males and no females. In that area, over off a few streets down, they had brothels. They had brothels, and the men would go do what they needed to do. Okay? And that was one interesting thing that when I presented the first time, somebody asked me, "Tell us about the brothels." And I said, well, I really can't tell you about the problem. I was just a little boy. So, but there were. And those disappeared. One thing that he insisted on, because my mom and my dad had a third-grade education. And they insisted that education was the most important aspect of our lives. So what we would do, during the week, education was a big thing. The weekends and summertime, us children would work out in the fields to earn money to help the family and to buy our clothing for the following school year. That's how we earned, that's what we did with our money. And we had a little girl, my parents had a little girl. So there's 5 of us siblings. All the children are hard workers and continue that through their adult life. We all went to graduate from high school. One went on to an education degree and a master's degree in education. 2 went into the military, 1 in the Air Force, 1 in the Army, 1 retiring after a 22-year career. 1 worked all his life in construction and retired. The sister was a housewife, is a housewife. She married a automaker, and she moved to California with him. Then she moved to Tennessee with him. And to this day, she's in Tennessee, and she's got 2 children that have graduated from college. When he passed away, he was able to see his children grow up and become very successful. One thing I like to say to all of you, anything you set your mind to do, you can do it. An example, I'm using myself as an example. I told you that I was working in the fields. I worked the fields, graduated from school, I joined the military. My travels took me all over the world. Got to see different cultures, different races, and met and have friends for a lifetime. Then after 22 years, I decided to become a teacher. And what followed through is what I see over here in the front. Students that have followed through, graduating from high school, going to college. That's what we need. We need education. Education is possible. So, this is a short little story about my dad. And he was a short little guy like me. And he was quite a character. But like I said, he was a hard worker. He is still hard work in all of us. And this is just one little story of among hundreds and hundreds and thousands of stories. Dependents of all the braceros could tell you their story. But I felt I needed to come and tell my story because if you have the drive, the desire, you can do anything you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for sharing that.
Before we terminate, I always like to open the floor to any questions that somebody might have, something you may not have covered, or something that you might have heard, or something that you or you're curious about. in terms of Bracero program. Because obviously, in many situations, you know, it has little or no place in history. They're, you know, they just don't write about it. Many instances of many things, not just the Bracero program, but you know, sometimes like you know, writing a story about World War II, for instance. You know, you can emphasize the campaign in Europe, or you can emphasize the Pacific campaign, or you emphasize the war at the Atlantic with the submarines and so forth. And so you get sometimes a view where a lot of things are covered, but very rarely, or barely covered. And sometimes we have a chance to answer those questions. So if you have any questions, please ask us, and we'll, you know, I'll do my best. We'll do whatever we can to, but you know, because again, you know, I didn't realize how far into a lot of the aspects of the Bracero program I had gotten involved with, and I didn't know about it. In Deming, for instance, we would watch in the early 50s. We'd watch the trucks come in, trucks just loaded with, you know, 14, 15, 20 Braceros at a time. They'd get out. They would close the stores and let the Braceros go in there and buy whatever they wanted. And so, whether it was a department store, or whether it was a supermarket, or whatever it was, they would close the store down so that to accommodate the Braceros coming in, and they would buy clothing, they'd buy food, whatever. So at the same time, when their contracts were over, they would buy a lot of stuff and take back to Mexico. So the economies of many, many towns were in large part depending on the turnover of the monies and the salaries that cost paid to the Braceros. A lot of people don't know, not aware of it. Anyway, if you have any comments, yes.
So the Bracero program was started by the U.S. here, and was that, did they like start it with Mexico? Was there some sort of collaboration on that? Or did they just say, hey, we're going to start this program?
It was a treaty between the United States and the Republic of Mexico. And the terms are fairly simple. We need your labor. And if you will send us your people, we will make sure, because they had inspectors from the Labor Department, we will make sure that they're treated well, they're paid well, and they get treated fairly and decently, and then when the contract's over, then you agree with these people to send them, that they will go back. And so that was the basic report. But yes, it was a formal agreement, formal treaty between the United States and Mexico.
So about their commitment to treating people well and that type of thing, you know, it sounds like that didn't always happen. I guess there was not someone checking on things, and
They had inspectors from the Labor Department to enforce those regulations. I've been in law enforcement. I just retired from law enforcement after 45 years. I can tell you, sometimes there are too many of us, and sometimes there's not ever enough around. So it all depended on what area, and sometimes growers would force or pressure their congressman to keep those people out, or to mitigate the circumstances and so forth, just like anything else. And a lot of them said, oh, okay, yeah, we'll comply. One of the things that even Mexico should not be proud of is that part of their pay was deducted, and it was put in a savings account in a couple banks in Mexico. Unfortunately, many braceros, when they terminated their status, went to claim those funds, and the banks, for some odd reason, simply couldn't find their accounts. So even now, they're still litigating, filing lawsuits to recover that money. We had a discussion coming up here where there's, I guess, at the consulate in El Paso, there are long lines of people going in to take this information down so they can claim the monies that were deducted for them. So there's enough blame to go around to the bad people, and then plenty of good things that came out of it. A lot of these people decided, I want to stay here. And this farmer, this rancher, this grower wants to help me bring my family over here, so that's what he did. And so, yeah, it came out just really great. And then their children are the beneficiaries of the decision to stay here. Their children now are in positions where they teach, they're involved with the police department, state police, or other federal, state law enforcement, or they're in college, or they're professors, or many, many fields that they would never have had a chance had they not been here, had they not been treated fairly, had they not been asked to stay, had they not made that decision, and had not the families encouraged them to come over and stay here. But also a lot of families said, no, come back here. I miss you. I want you. You're the father of our children. You need to be over here. And so that too was something that they had to go through.
Thank you.
Just in general, what was the perspective or the policy on labor pertaining to children, and how did it change over time?
As far as the Bracero program, you had to be 18 before you had a chance. That was mandatory. You had to be 18 years of age. Now, as far as many farmers, now mind you, during this same period of time, we had illegal immigration. We still had people coming in illegally, not through the Bracero program. And so the Mexican government worked closely with the U.S. government in many instances to help stop the illegal immigration coming in for a very basic reason. They didn't want the farmers and growers to reduce the pay scale that they're paying the Braceros, because it was not in the Braceros' interest to have their countrymen come in illegally and take the jobs that they had signed up for. Now, those people that were here illegally, a lot of them had their families, their sons and daughters, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, working out in the fields in that respect. And a lot of the growers allowed it, encouraged it, simply because some of the ones that valued the almighty dollar more than the health or the welfare of the workers, to them it was okay. And so in that respect, Cesar Chavez, for instance, tried to was against the program and tried to help get it stopped, because in his view, and the view of many citizens here, decided that those braceros are keeping the wage scale low, and we that live here have to compete with them, and we're not going to be doing that labor, not for what they're making. So there was a lot of controversy associated with the program, as with anything in immigration. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment. I just want to thank you guys. I just happened to stumble into this meeting. I was here to read a book, but you brought back a lot of memories. Because I'm also 50. I was born in '53 myself, and my dad was a bracero también. And I was born and raised here in the little town of Artesia, New Mexico. And I went to school here too, worked here also, to make a long story short. But I just want to thank you. Like I said, you brought back a lot of memories, and I learned a lot too at the same time. Thank you guys.
It was, and I know many families like yourselves. They ended up taking their children out there. I know during the summers when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, my grandfather would take us, maybe half a dozen children, and have us go do things like hoe weeds in cotton fields and stuff like that. Not very heavy labor, but it was not pleasant. It certainly helped me to determine that says, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I was brought up under the tutelage of my uncles, and they made me write my name and learn my ABCs and do some simple math before I went to school. My grandmother thought it would be a shame, humiliation for the family to send me to school without knowing how to read and write. I think you got the complex, the situation went wrong. But anyway, I was a beneficiary of that, and so I learned that education was an absolutely must. It was the prize, the golden ring that you had to grab, the brass ring. But anyway, you know, but I was also getting to the age when I was starting to be interested in girls, and I was told by my uncles, and it was propaganda, but it was beaten in my head over and over and over again. Don't ever have anything to do with girls until after you graduate and after you get a job. And because if you looked at a girl a certain way, she would become pregnant. So I avoided them as much as possible. My first date that I ever got was here in beautiful downtown Western Mexico University. I learned about pizza. And so anyway, I told people about that. And that didn't go so well because we went down there, and the next thing I know, to come pay for it, I'd forgotten my wallet. So that never happened again. But the thing about it is that we all learn and appreciate how wonderful education is. But also, learning means remembering back there, remembering what they went through to get us this far. Whether it's the Bracero program, or people that came from overseas, or people that came from other states to start a new life here. To me, I see the progress here is amazing. I'm still in awe of what's going on, contrary to what I had when I got here. It was nice then, because we had a very little tiny library in Hachira, but to come over here is like a brand new city, and which it was. But anyway, I'm just very fond of the people that, especially the descendants of the Braceros and the Braceros themselves, working so hard under a lot of harsh conditions, not because the growers necessarily make the work, but that's hard work, period. Whether it was done by the people from Mexico or Russia or China or any other place. That is hard work. And some people did that all their lives. And they, from the day they were able to get out in the field until they died, that was the work they did. And many of them were hoping that their children would have a better circumstance than they did. But thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much to our true special guests for being here in Silver City today. I'm required to mention that these great photos that you see are part of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, so they've generously let us use them. And there's these wonderful booklets that give information about the artists that couldn't be here tonight, and you can learn more about what they're doing. And this exhibit will be up until November 15th here in the library. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.